Good evening. This is Tuesday, March the 19th, 2019, and we are so glad to have a Gracie Hornsby to share with us tonight. We have our Kevin Primus, the program chair for Rotary E-Club of District 7710. He will share tonight an introduction on Gracie.
Good evening, everyone. This is Kevin Primus, and I want to introduce Gracie Hornsby, who I recently met at a Goodnight Scholars event at NC State. And Gracie is a junior at NC State and an active member of the Goodnight Scholars program, and a university scholar from Franklin, North Carolina, majoring in civil engineering. Her focus is on water resources with a minor in environmental science. Recently, Gracie completed an internship experience in Cameroon with the Circle of Women for Social Action and Aid. During this 6-week experience, Gracie put her growing knowledge of engineering concepts to work by spearheading a water quality and sanitation project to build gravity-fed sand water filtration systems and basic pit latrines in 5 rural villages in Cameroon. It was full of challenges and growth opportunities, and we're hoping that tonight Gracie will share some of those, as well as have a little bit of a dialogue about just what it's like being a college student leading a project like this. So Gracie, I'm going to just turn this over to you, and I may interject some questions along the way, but I think that you have a lot to share with us tonight. So thank you so much for being here.
Great, thank you for the introduction. So Kevin covered a lot of the intro on me. I'm natively from North Carolina, going to NC State right now. But yeah, so this was just kind of something I chose to do with my summer, and it wasn't random by any means. This is what I want to do as a career. It's funny, I just came from an event and we were talking about the Sustainable Development Goals. And so this is all over Sustainable Development Goal 6. Which is clean water and sanitation. And so that's so much more than just clean drinking water. It's adequate water for bathing, because there are water wash diseases. There's adequate water for cooking. But then you have to get into the definition of adequate, which gets into the definition of access, and what is potable water, what is good quality water, what is improved sanitation, what is safely managed sanitation. And so a lot of those are just kind of definitions, but of course, whenever it gets into practice, that's very, very different. What things actually look like on the ground, implemented in different cultures, what people actually want to have them implemented. And then getting into the side that I think sometimes engineers don't necessarily talk about, which is happiness and satisfaction, and the fact that people should be happy with, water interventions that come into their living space, because while it might be a 6-week, even 6-year project on the really, really long side, it should be for the rest of their life that they're using that water source, if it is designed to function in perpetuity. So that was a big learning experience for me, actually understanding that while this is one system, or ended up being 3 systems for me across the 4 villages, they are still there and they are living it every single day, and this is truly their only source of water. So kind of feeling the responsibility that comes with having the privilege of being a college student and doing this work. That was kind of a big focus of my summer. But I was thinking I could walk through some of the technical aspects of the project. I'm not sure exactly the nature of your water project that you just submitted. I'd love to hear about it some, to kind of put in context for the rest of the presentation. And then I can move on to kind of the more technical aspects of what I ended up doing.
So Gracie, would you be able to kind of, before I think it would be great to hear about our water project, but could you give us a little bit of an overview of what the project was like? Were you on a team of many students and faculty, or was it not like that?
Yeah, so it wasn't like that. I actually, through a newsletter in the civil engineering department, I got connected with a company called NGO Abroad. So it is for students and professionals that are looking to use their skills abroad. So it is explicitly not just ecotourism. And it is even more so not voluntourism, but it's actually seeing people who would like to work overseas or just put their skills to use in more of a nonprofit or like B Corp setting. And then finding a place where they can fit in. So NGO Abroad is really just an intermediary company that connects you with a local community partner. And so then the local community partner that I ended up being the best fit for, with my interest for water and sanitation and the gender equality issues that go with both of those, was Circle of Women for Social Action and Mutual Aid in Cameroon. And while it is technically a nonprofit in Cameroon, just due to recent events and kind of training people up and sending people out, it's really actually just one really incredible woman now. Celestine is the one who really anchors the organization. And so I lived with her in her home the whole time. And then we lived in an abandoned home in one of the villages that we were working in. But it was just me. So that was the really intimidating part going in. It was, I was the only volunteer this summer. So in everything we did, I was the only non-Cameroonian. There was a significant language barrier. I don't speak French, but Celestine speaks enough English that wouldn't be an issue. They were really looking more for, well, they were looking for an engineer, but they got me. They got an engineering student. So we both had to adjust our expectations a little bit because I thought I was working with an organization. And really I was working with one person. So, but it ended up being a really unique growth experience for me, because I had more responsibility than I was comfortable with. And I had a lot of ethical dilemmas in this, because I was trying to understand or trying to debate whether it was unethical for me to work on this project because I didn't feel qualified. And there were real repercussions. If we didn't develop the springs correctly, we could actually make their water resources worse. And they don't have the capital to make them better on their own. Or do I take the experience because maybe just by the fact that I am willing to do this, does that make me more qualified than others because I am willing to take the step to go to Cameroon? So there were a lot of ethical dilemmas for me. And especially since the nature of the project, like the actual project itself, did change from the time that I signed on to work with the organization to the time that we were actually on the ground and building. Because as Kevin had said, because that was from an interview I did with the scholars program before I went, we were supposed to build gravity sand filters, which are very non-invasive. It's a whole separate unit. It has nothing to do with the actual water source at all. It's just an after filtration step that would better the quality of the water. But about a week before I left, Celestine, she WhatsApp messaged me, like all good business deals happen. And she was like, we need to talk about the nature of the project. And I was like, okay, great. And I had all these fantastic facts I was going to tell her about how the biofilm layer works on top of the biosand filters and how they can really better the microbiological quality of the water, and then like the sedimentation phase and predation. And I had watched like 4 YouTube videos, and I really felt like I was ready to talk about this. And the first thing she told me is that they won't work. Someone had evidently built it, I think 6 or 8 of these in nearby villages before, but they didn't leave any like O&M, like no operation and maintenance instructions. And so, as you can imagine, with sand that is filtering water, eventually it filled. And there's no instructions on back flushing, no instructions on maintenance at all. So they stopped working. They clogged, water just sat on top, no water went through. So she just told me it won't work. They don't want them. We can't do it. And so I was sitting there like, well, that's what I came to do. So of course I was concerned. I was like, do you not want me to volunteer anymore? She's like, no. We're just going to dig wells instead. I was like, we have a $300 budget. I don't think that we're digging wells. And so that was my first fun mishap with the language barrier. And I finally figured out a variation of what she meant by well, which was actually like a shallow surface water well, which is classified by the UN as an unimproved drinking water source. So we didn't want to go with that. And I found online, it was something that had actually been done in Cameroon before, and that's employed pretty globally, which is just development of a spring source, which is putting, it's called a spring box. And you literally cast a concrete box on top of the spring source. You have to trace it back to the spring source first. I can go to my next slide. So the thing on the left is what I thought that we were building. Very simple, a nice little cartoon. And then on the right is what we actually ended up doing without the storage component. It's just a free-flowing system. So the box is slightly more above ground. There's no tap, so water freely flows because the villagers were more comfortable with that than having an element of storage that could accumulate biological contaminants. So water just freely flows out like it would from a spring source. And so the main purpose of these boxes is that you eliminate, you're not bettering the quality of the water in any way. You're just protecting it from being degraded. So you're protecting it from surface water runoff, because surface water is known to be the most contaminated water that somebody can drink, which is what was previously being used for drinking water. And then animal contact, which is another huge piece. Anything with, anytime it touches animals, you're almost definitely going to find animal fluids or animal feces, especially in the water, which is connected to so many waterborne diseases. And in particular, dysentery and typhoid was the heaviest disease burden in these villages whenever I arrived. So this is kind of that was the basic setup. It was me, and it was Celestine, and it was about 15 men representing 15 families, or a little less, probably 12 families, between 4 villages, and a lot of concrete and not a lot of money. And not a lot of know-how on my end either, but kind of what was left to do was to start, because I was there, and I figured that we should probably do something other than nothing.
Wow. So next important question, how old are you, Gracie? How old?
At the time, was I 19 or 20? I was 20.
Okay. And now you're 21.
I am. Yeah, so this was just last summer. This is still, it feels like a long time ago, but I guess it was about 6 months ago now.
So I just want to end the meeting on that. No, just kidding. It's pretty amazing. I think that my colleagues would agree that it's really amazing, just the approach that you've taken and the willingness and the knowledge the knowledge base that you have, and the guts that you have to follow through with a project like that is, truly amazing. I know you wanted to hear about our water project. Rhonda, are you available to share maybe about a 3-minute, summary of what we've been up to in Arusha?
Sure. And that's fabulous, Gracie. So glad that you had that opportunity to have that experience. We here at Rotary E-Club are very familiar with water projects. We started in 2015 when we chartered our club with just actually an all-girl boarding school, had no running water. They had pipes that were burst, and so we were basically repairing and replacing pipes throughout the school. And for the same reason, as you said, were having all kinds of waterborne diseases entering into the school with these girls, because they didn't have clean cooking and such water coming in. They were using buckets, and just how they were handling the water from the source. It was actually coming from the military. So at any rate, we did that project. That was phase 1. We understood that there was a larger issue actually in place, that they needed a new water system. The system they had was not set up to support the over 300 students that they had. So what we did the first time with Rotary, just a FYI, kind of going through the same process you had, was we did a bidding with contractors in the local area to actually build this, replace and repair the pipes. And we found out that it wasn't adequate, that they actually didn't do a great job because of the non-standards or what have you, or limited standards that they had. And so looking at phase 2, if we were going to engage in it, we had to have qualified, people in place. What we have here in Rotary is called a Water and Sanitation Rotarian Action Group. And that group actually was very instrumental in getting us assistance and understanding. They had, as you're showing here, very scientific questions for me, and not being a water engineer. I was like, I can't really do this, because I'm working with a teacher on the other end, in a school, and myself. And so it was like the questions they were asking were very important. And considering that, again, the sustainability and making sure that we didn't make mistakes as before, how do we go forward? So we were suggested to work with a group called Water Mission, and I'll be very happy to give you all the contact information for them. They're in North Charleston, South Carolina based, but they actually do water projects throughout, areas where there's not conflict as much as natural disasters. Okay, so in this case, they're doing a lot of refugee projects in Tanzania. And at the time, they had maybe 3 years been in Arusha, Tanzania, doing projects. And so it was a perfect match for us to work with them. And they're actually putting in a borehole and a solar-powered water system. And so I'll be happy to share with you the diagrams and things like that. But that's ultimately what we're doing, bringing the system up to date and making it so that it will actually support the 300 plus staff that's actually there at the school. We are engaged with the other Rotary Club, so kind of addressing some of the things you were talking about, not having others that are knowledgeable around, or even the language barriers and such like that. So Rotary requires us to have a Rotary Club in place to be on the ground. So we have a very good teacher. He's now a Rotarian. He's working with us with the Rotary Club, and then we are working with them, and then we have Water Mission. So we're making sure that we're covering all of our bases. And the good thing about Water Mission is they actually have all of their employees are Tanzanians, and they actually train local people. So there's some tasks that will be done, like the digging of, certain things they'll be doing, that they actually train local people that want to learn. They'll train them on how to do this work as well. So there is, as you say, a sustainability portion of it. We have a WASH program that will be implemented with the school so that it will continue in the future to be clean, safe water for the school. But they also will train, actually financially, how to maintain the system. So they train them on how to manage it, but also how to financially support it. So that if there's parts that are, broke or missing or whatever, there's a certain coverage that they have as Water Mission, but then after that. And what was recent, I was expressing that I had to get through the MOUs and stuff. Water Mission had to explain again that they are nonprofit and they are not getting paid to do this job. So they actually have great relationships with FedEx and a company in Germany and some others that actually, when they put the system in, it's expected to last a lifetime. Yeah. So it's not, it's not done haphazardly or short term, so that's why we went with them. Being with WASRAG, I've seen many different systems, many different ways. So this is just why we proposed this, because it's a school, an institution, and wanted something that would last long term. I know that's past 3 minutes, sorry.
No, that was great context to hear, because of course the nature of the projects is really different. What I was getting to work on was really, really scaled down, extremely rural and extremely decentralized. Even though it was a centralized source for these villages, like it was roughly one per village. That's still fairly decentralized if we're talking about a grid and piped water and boreholes, or basically anything piped that is being supplied to an institution like a school. But I do think that there's so much common ground, because if you're talking about adoption of the technology, that was a big deal this summer, as far as willingness to use the system, but to use the system correctly. Because if you use an improved system incorrectly, you can very quickly make it an unimproved water source, and negate all of the benefits that you could be getting from this intervention. What was the other thing? I was writing a couple notes. Oh yeah, and the fact of perpetuity, like kind of designing with permanence in mind. There's actually this very interesting article. It's kind of like the foundation of water and sanitation, and it's called The Sanitary City. So it's talking about London as a case study. Whenever they were designing systems, whenever they first started putting in, London had one of the first sewer systems in the world that separated like solid waste, human waste from drinking water, and truly trying to keep those separate. And but it was really interesting because at the time they came up with this technology that they believed to be fantastic. This was they isolated the fact that waterborne diseases were a thing, that cholera was spread through water. So they wanted to keep everything separate and clean, and they were trying to look at disinfection, and it was really cutting edge at the time. But the systems that they ended up putting in, since they were so permanent, it didn't actually leave room for innovation in the future. Thinking about that, yes, the water system at the time was fantastic, but 200 years from then, even though it was designed to work forever, which was good at the time, they wanted something that would last, so it would keep being good. But technology advanced so far past that, that it actually locked people into like this lower level of service than they could get just because the systems were so permanent. And so I think that that's an interesting thing to think about. Not that piping systems should be avoided because they're permanent. I think that piped water is definitely a good thing, and it's going to be so positive for the school. But it is kind of interesting to think about that, like, because someone installed pipes in that school, it kind of locks that school into this certain system. Or you have to do what you guys are doing and completely overhaul the system, that it was just not enough water. So I guess that was kind of a tangent, but that's what was brought up in my mind, kind of thinking about how decisions now are actually going to affect people's level of service, level of sanitation in perpetuity. So I think there's definitely a lot of good parallels between our two projects that we can kind of dive into further with the time we've got left.
Thank you. I'd like to hear more about your the human waste aspects. I think that was a very interesting aspect about your project, that you were focusing on human waste, or at least that's what I thought that I heard.
So the human waste aspect actually ended up being a lot less than we thought. Whenever, it's always big. I like to say that you can't talk about clean water without talking about sanitation, because sanitation has been kind of the ugly stepchild for so many years. There's a statistic that it's like for every $1 or for every like $5 given to clean water aid and clean water projects, $1 will be given to sanitation, when in reality, sanitation and safely managing human waste is generally one of the biggest strains on a water system, on actually having good clean water. But it's much more popular to take a picture of a well spewing from the ground and people celebrating with clean water, this happy moment, than putting in a pit latrine with a sealed concrete slab. That doesn't make a great press release. So originally the plan was, whenever we would do the sand water filters, because it's less material, it's less cost, less construction time as well, they're very quick to assemble, that we would also work on pit latrines. So I have a lot of kind of book knowledge about it because I was prepared to build them. And in some of my coursework at NC State right now, we talk a lot about sanitation and what it means to safely manage human waste. But we didn't actually end up building pit latrines through our project. There was one family that chose to improve their own latrine just based on like recommendations that we were able to make, with even down to the shape of the hole, how you seal it, what really counts as like improved sanitation, and what is going to be microbiologically safe. But really the main interaction with sanitation that the project I ended up carrying out had was just keeping it out of the water. How do we, theoretically, we have this really great source of water, which is natural spring water coming up out of the ground all over the place. But as soon as it hits the surface, like almost as soon as it hits the surface, it's getting contaminated. So how do we avoid that? How do we keep hog waste out of it? How do we keep human waste out of it? How do we keep animals themselves out of it? And how do we kind of get this new level of understanding of what actually makes a good quality water source. Because one of the really interesting misconceptions in the village was that they had a pool of water. Actually, I can go to the next slide. So these were the 4 unimproved pools that people were drinking directly from. There was no form of treatment being carried out on the water because some person that I'm so mad at, some person somewhere in the world told them that the reason that boiled water tastes worse is because it has less oxygen. And I'm like, well, it's still H2O. I can guarantee you the chemical structure is still the same, but they weren't willing to boil their water. That just wasn't going to happen. It was off the table. So these were the 4 sources that were being used for drinking water. I look at that bottom right one, especially. So this is the one where the misconception about life in water was brought up, because they thought that since frogs and tadpoles and small fish lived in this pool, because it's fed from the bottom, it's an artisanal spring fed just straight from the bottom, water wells up. They thought that since there was living animals, since there were living animals in this water, that it meant that the water was healthy. It could maintain life because it could maintain life in the water for these animals. And of course, if you think about it, well, animals defecate, animals track everything into the water, especially frogs, which are amphibious, going in and out of the water all day. So we look at it and we say, there's a fish in my water, I probably shouldn't drink it. But that just wasn't common knowledge. So we spent so much of the time at the start of the project just kind of breaking down these barriers that were artificially put up against these people having clean water. A lot of it had to do with education, which is why I think it's so great that this water project is being carried out in a school. I mean, schools carry so much weight as far as sustainable development. They represent a good education. They represent a lot of times a person's only warm meal or only good meal that day. They represent a source of clean water, education on hand washing. I love that you guys are doing wash training as well. So I think it's amazing that it's centered at a school, because that was one of the huge barriers in this project. Because and I never mean for this to be offensive to like the villagers that I was working with, but gravity was not a universally understood concept, which was, with an engineering background, is just like mind-blowing, because it's something that I've been taught forever. But whenever we were talking about basic sand filtration works by, you have sand, water goes through it, and it's gravity fed. It doesn't work by being in proximity to water. And water doesn't just go places because it would be good for the water to go there. Water has to go there because it is gravity fed, or a force pushes it there. And generally that force is gravity. So whenever we were talking about very, very basic filtration options, I was suggesting that behind the boxes, we always had to backfill with gravel because we needed empty space for the water to populate before it flowed into the box. And I suggested that we could put small amounts of sand there, small amounts of very coarse grained sand that wouldn't get bogged down, and that it could provide very, very basic treatment if there were large leaves or something. And it wouldn't provide filtration in the long term. It was really just while particles were settling out after construction, then it served no more purpose, because the water coming out of the spring shouldn't be turbid. But they just kept pushing and said, we want sand at the bottom of the box. We want sand here. We want sand here. And I finally had this realization whenever Celestine kept going like this with her hand. And I was like, what are you doing? Why are, like, it was just so frustrating because there was such a barrier. And then I finally figured out that she was telling me that the water would go into the box. It would enter the sand. It would come back up through the sand, and it would exit the box, and it would be filtered. And it was just one of those considerations that I didn't make, because in my mind, I think if water goes down, it doesn't come back up unless something pushes it back up. But that just wasn't universally understood. And that's not their fault if they have no formal training in physics. That's not necessarily universally understood. And so I think that I just continually had like kind of these barriers broken down for myself also, because so many of the communication barriers in this project were put up by me, because I'm used to being in a university environment where you get more respect when you use loftier terms. But that doesn't aid communication at all. That doesn't aid understanding. That doesn't aid trust. It doesn't aid anything that improves these projects. It really just kind of aids our own egos whenever we can use all the terms that people use about water. So once we kind of started breaking down these barriers of things that people had been told that weren't true about water, ways that I spoke and ways that I thought that weren't beneficial to the project. I mean, it's kind of like the Rotary slogan. I'll be honest, this is the only slogan I know, but is it fair? Is it good to all concerned? And I know I didn't even quote that completely correctly, but it's kind of using that idea. Is the thing that I am employing, the tool that I'm employing, the words that I'm employing, the way that I'm making people feel with my actions, is that good to all concerned in this project? And if it's not, I should probably stop doing it because it's not productive anymore.
Wow. I know why Kevin brought you to us. You know what? I'm going to let someone else talk because I can take it now the rest of the night. Anyone else have any questions for Gracie? I mean, I really do have a lot I can say, and I do have some questions, but I want to give Jean or Kathy or Eve or MG a chance to engage here because I think it's phenomenal.
Thank you.
Well, Gracie, I have just one question, and I think that this was a great project for you. I think from a learning perspective and dealing with a project that could have went south real quick.
Mm-hmm.
You did very well in maintaining your sanity and your professionalism. My question is, how long was the project intended to be for you initially?
Okay, yeah. So unfortunately, it had to have a hard start and stop time by the nature of me not having enough money to book one-way flights both ways. It had to be a round-trip ticket. So it was 6 weeks. I originally had intended, so I had a lot of determination in how long the project would be. I chose 6 weeks because I don't want to put up any facade like I was completely confident going into this project. I nearly backed out probably 3 different times, and had I not had the support system around me telling me that this is what you care about, this is what you should do, I probably would have. Just because the internet tells you pretty nasty things about Cameroon that aren't true in a lot of areas and aren't true if you're with the right people. But if you listen to those bad things the internet is telling you, I think you miss out on a lot of really good experiences if you're just, because you can fix those with just being safe, with being smart, with having the right connections on the ground. But anyways, so I originally had planned on going for nearly 12 weeks. I wanted to be there for my entire summer. I just figured that if I'm getting the plane ticket over there, I'm making the nearly 70-hour trip over there by the time Turkish Airlines delays every single one of my flights. And then I should probably stay there for a while. But I eventually decided, just due to knowing how I sometimes get sick abroad, and then analyzing the nature of the project and how long I actually thought it would take, and kind of the benefits of sometimes constraining a project and saying, we need to finish it in this amount of time, because things miraculously get finished on time whenever someone is leaving, because this project would have taken 12 weeks if I was there for 12 weeks. So yeah, it was a balance between being there for long enough to actually feel like I was making an impact and learning and actually accomplishing something, with the time constraint of I'm a student, I only have 3 months in a summer, and then saying that considering I was alone, I just wasn't comfortable going for the full 12 weeks.
Anyone else? MG or Eve or Kathy?
Yeah, one other question. Was there an issue? And I generally ask these questions when I have, we have guests who are in a foreign country. From a governmental standpoint, they did not either want or have a connection with the government to take care of this filtration issue?
No. So it's funny, the way that Celestine referred to this, she would say that we were going to the bush whenever we were going to the villages, because they're still on a chief system. They're not nearly as traditional. These villages weren't. They're not nearly as traditional as the village that Celestine grew up in. But their governmental structure is still, you have a chief who inherits their chiefdom. They're not elected by any means. But so they really have very, very little connection with the Cameroonian government. So there have been a number of water and sanitation projects carried out in Cameroon, but there are two major cities, and they're always carried out in either Yaoundé or Douala. We were in Yaoundé. That's where Celestine lives, and it was about 2 hours. It was 2 to 3 taxis and a motorbike to get to the villages. So she would call that the bush. And then whenever we were working in the water or working with water or working in the cassava fields with the different plantations, the different crops they were growing and gathering food while we were there, she'd call it the way back bush, or that was my translation. It was basically the way back bush. So simply, the Cameroonian government forgot about these people a really long time ago. They don't really consider them constituents because no one votes. They don't have the capital to take themselves into the city regularly to go vote. And whenever you do, there's so much corruption in the elections that, and this is from Celestine telling me this, and the reasons that she doesn't vote, you can either be paid a small amount to vote a certain way, and that can give you a meal, or you can not vote because you know that in reality it doesn't actually really matter how you vote because the elections are so corrupt that the votes aren't being counted anyways. And it's kind of the same thing with taxes. Celestine, being a very, very upstanding woman, stopped paying taxes 3 years ago because she recognized that probably over 50% of it is going into politicians' pockets in this country whenever it's supposed to be put towards clean water projects. So there's such a distrust for the governmental structure in Cameroon, at least from the different people that I talk to. Just everyone in these villages are subsistence farmers and subsistence hunters. The men will go hunt at night. I got to eat porcupine because of that. They gave me a porcupine one day, which was delicious. But yeah, so their really only connection to society is that some of them, they'll cut wood, like very small wood chunks in certain, these like defined sizes, give them to a person that is going to, or sell them to a person that is going to the city. The person going to the city then sells them to a person who's going to sell it in the city. And then the person in the city actually sells it. So you can imagine the markup. These people are being paid almost nothing for their labor, but they get enough money that if they need a new shirt, or if they occasionally need to go to the hospital, or something really drastic happens, they have a few funds. Otherwise, everything is just really, they're in their village all the time. And so I think that they lost the hope that their government was going to do something for them a really long time ago. And hope was kind of a big theme at the end. Talking about the hope that you have the determination to change your water situation or your sanitation situation or your educational situation. Because I think that if people are told for long enough that they are poor, you lose the hope that you will ever not be poor or you will ever not be without X, Y, and Z. So whenever you're told that for long enough, you lose hope also. And I think the only thing worse than being extremely impoverished and extremely resource restricted is not having any hope that that's ever going to change for you because you stop trying to change it. These people 100% have the capacity to change it for themselves, but whenever you're continually told that you don't have the capacity to change it for yourself, you stop trying. And I can't blame them for that. So yeah, it was just, the government was basically not involved with them at all. And I think that that's where NGOs and organizations like Rotary can play a really, really large role in development for these people that have pretty much been forgotten by their own country.
Well, I think that also explains the gravity issue and the
Yes.
and the frogs dancing around the pond.
Yep, unfortunately.
Thanks, Jean. Anyone else? One more.
Gracie, this is Kathy. I just want to comment and then a question. Just very, very impressed with your passion and commitment to this project.
Thank you.
So what is the next step for them?
Mm-hmm.
Just to continue?
Yeah, so the next step for this village, or for these 3 villages, there's so many. There are a lot of, it would take a long time to get into. There's a lot of very kind of toxic dynamics going on. I mentioned the chief, and I mentioned that he inherited his position because he's completely unqualified to hold his position. He was showing up drunk to the work site. He was telling people to go home because he didn't want to work that day. He was directly sabotaging. He was making some pretty sexist comments towards Celestine and I. He was stealing materials because he didn't have a concern for the people that he was supposed to represent, but he had a concern for his own family. So sorry, I'm getting very wrapped up and I've almost forgotten your question, but it was, yeah, so whenever your leaders are just kind of inherited, you run into a lot of issues. I'm so sorry. I actually did forget your question because I got really angry.
Sorry, what I was really inquiring about was next steps.
Yes, next steps. So sorry.
Yeah. No, that's okay.
Yeah. So what I was leading into actually, next steps is kind of unity and cohesive, and actually these villages becoming more than single subsistence farmers, and recognizing that they have more power, they have more know-how as a community, actually working together. As of now, these spring boxes are actually their basically only shared resource that they use. They were sharing the same ponds before, but it wasn't anything developed, so they didn't really perceive it as shared. But now that there's something that's been built there, they actually are forced to perceive this as a shared community resource, which I touch in with Celestine all the time to make sure that things are still going well, that everything is still flowing. We don't need to like troubleshoot issues. But yeah, I think that unity and feelings of community and actual community cooperation is the next huge step for these families, because individually they don't necessarily have the know-how to build better sanitation facilities. They don't have the know-how to fix, not every single person ended this project with the know-how to fix every box because people were being pulled off the work site by a drunk chief. But together they do have all of the know-how and all of the information and the skills to maintain the boxes. They have the know-how and the materials and everything to actually build improved pit latrines, because one family that we worked with that did improve their latrine while we were there, it's not sealed by a concrete slab, but it's sealed enough to where flies aren't entering and leaving, and they're not practicing open defecation, which probably over 50% of the people in these villages still currently practice. So I think that if the kind of unity and community issues begin to get fixed, I think that they're going to see better quality of life in the area of sanitation and especially open defecation. I think that they'll start seeing better food security because they have farming practices that they can share. Or I think they'll also see better food security from some people are really great hunters and some people are not. Kind of building these community ties and recognizing that, I mean, I like to use the analogy that a closed hand is safe. Because a closed hand, you're not going to lose what you have, but an open hand actually allows you to receive new things, but it does allow you to lose what you have. So you feel this essence of risk. So kind of getting that open hand mentality that I'm going to put the trust in my neighbors and put the trust in my community to open my hand and offer what I have, trusting that they won't take it and run. And I think that that is a huge step for this community. And that's why I'm so glad that Celestine is still there. She is still doing this work every day. This is her life. This is what she's doing forever. And because she's formally trained as a social worker, this is her arena, getting people to understand that they have hope, understand that they have resources, they have the know-how to change their situation, and working on these kind of underlying social issues that are present in every technical engineering issue. And that's what she's continuing work on. So I'm really excited to see if there will be developments in the future, or even if I were to get to go back one day and kind of work on these developments more personally.
Well, thank you so much, Gracie. I'm going to ask that I can share the screen now.
Yes, I'll stop sharing.
And I will, I would like to close out with saying thank you very much for your taking the time tonight to share with us. I'm trying to go into presenter mode. This is a certificate of appreciation for Gracie Hornsby for imparting valuable insights and inspiration as our guest speaker. We, again, are very appreciative of the information that you've shared. And this is what we call the four-way test. You were actually mentioning it as our slogan, but would you like to say it with us?
I would love to.
Okay. The four-way test of the things we think, say, or do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And with that, I'm going to actually stop the recording.